Welcome to Garden Wise Adventures. My name is Malie, and today is a beautiful day, mid-November, and it's time to kind of finish up my garden cleanup. So we're going to be doing several videos today, and the first one is going to be to show you how I put my garden beds to bed. Now, I try to have all of my cleanup done by Thanksgiving, but Thanksgiving seems to be traditionally the time in the 15 years that I've lived here where right after Thanksgiving, within a few days, we have a heavy freeze. We've already had heavy freezes, but it ends up with snow, and then the temperatures dip to the point that everything ends up being frozen for most of the rest of the winter. The leaves get pasted to the ground, they're frozen, they're wet, and they're really hard to clean up, as is all of the plants that I need to cut back. So I usually start with my compost pile, and what I do with the compost that's in the pile is I add them to my garden beds. So today's video is going to show you what I do with my compost and how I amend my garden beds. So let me show you the beds that I'm going to do right now and show you some of the beds that I did earlier. So this is my lower area. I grew sweet potatoes in this bed. Now this bed I built last spring. It's a new bed. It's a Vajayga raised metal bed, 17 inches tall, and I think it's the 6 by 3.5 feet. I absolutely love these beds. Over here we have the same bed. It's the same size as this one, but we configured it to be an 8 by 2. So I grew tomatoes in these two beds. These two beds are the same size. And then I grew sweet potatoes in here. And what I did for soil is for the very first time ever, I brought in just garden soil from a nursery rather than using my mix. Now I use kind of a modified meal mix, which is 1/3 compost, 1/3 peat moss, and 1/3 vermiculite. Now I use vermiculite instead of perlite so that it'll hold moisture. But I wanted to try just regular kind of soil to see how it would work. And it's been kind of a bit of a toss-up. The sweet potatoes did abysmally. So bad that I didn't even film it. They were tiny, and as you can see the clumps in this bed, I think it was really kind of dense. I think it was too hard for the sweet potatoes to expand. So we're going to continue amending this bed. We're going to add compost. I think we're just going to add the compost over the top of the old straw that mulched the bed. We're going to add grass clippings. My lawn is at the point where it needs to be mowed. We've got a lot of leaves on it, so we're going to mow up the leaves and the lawn clippings, put them on all the beds down here. And then I've got some fresh straw to mulch over the top, and then we'll just leave these over the winter. Now the beds that had the tomatoes in them did beautifully. The tomatoes grew big and lush and easily, and we had a huge production. So this kind of soil was great for tomatoes, not so good for sweet potatoes. We also had, tried growing in straw bales. I just had some extra full straw bales that had the rope around them still. So I put those in a triangle and filled them with the same soil that we had everywhere else and put potatoes in here. And the potatoes did quite well. But the straw bales, as you can see what's left of them, which is hardly anything. They decomposed very, very quickly. So we're going to use all of this soil and all of the straw. Eventually, probably in the spring, we're going to be purchasing another round bed just like that one that my Jerusalem artichokes are in. And we're going to put another bed in the middle here. When I blew out my irrigation, it kind of popped the irrigation off. But anyway, we are going to be redoing this bed later in the spring, so we're just going to leave it the way it is. This is the bed on the end with all the block around it is one of my earlier beds, and the kale and chard is doing beautifully in those. We're going to just add more compost. Maybe because it's sunk down a little bit, we're going to add some more peat moss and vermiculite, build this bed back up, and same with this one. What we're going to do is we're going to leave my arugula, I can never pronounce that correctly. What we're going to do is leave my arugula and just kind of mulch around it and see how well it does over the winter. There have been several arugula plants over the years that have survived the winter, and we're just going to see how well they do. But the rest of the bed, we're going to be building this up with peat moss compost and vermiculite too. Now these are beds that I actually finished amending earlier this year. I think it was in September. No, it was actually October that I planted these. These are going to be my overwintering vegetables, and look how beautiful they're doing. I amended these beds the exact same way I'm going to be amending the others. And what I do is I just cover them with frost cloth and greenhouse plastic, and then I just harvest over the winter. I live in Utah zone 6/7, and even when it gets in the teens or the single digits, these do just fine. This is my other bed. I'm experimenting with adding water in here, just letting the water absorb the heat during the day and release it in the evening. But you can kind of see the difference in size for those with the water and without the water. Now, it could be that this bed is getting a little bit more sun than this bed over here, but I don't know. We're just going to continue over the winter and testing it and see how it works. These are my spring crops that have not been covered yet. These are cauliflower, some flowering, sprouting broccoli, and some chiji-misai. Now, this bed hasn't been watered for over a week. I think about a week ago, we had a 1/4 inch of rainfall. That's the only water it's gotten. So I am going to need to come through and water these again. Cauliflower is a lot more frost sensitive, and they have hit the teens and hasn't killed them yet, but the cauliflower isn't heading up as well as I would like. But we're going to leave it as long as it'll live and see if we can get a harvest out of it, even if it's tiny. Now, the chiji-misai, on the other hand, which is a cross between tatsoi and komatsuna, is actually doing beautifully. They're very drought tolerant and cold tolerant, and we're just going to leave those up and continue harvesting the outer leaves until they're dead. This is my shallot bed. About half of it is filled with shallot, the other half is empty. And I amended this bed the exact same way that I'm going to amend the other beds, so this is what it looks like. We've got grass clippings underneath the straw and compost underneath the grass clippings. This is another winter garden that looks like it needs to be watered. We just barely uncovered it. When I uncovered it, they weren't wilting, but now they're getting a little bit more sun. They're definitely going to need some water. These did not get the rainfall, so it's been 2.5 to 3 weeks since they've been watered. This is another fall bed that looks like it needs to be watered. Now, I cover these when the temperatures get into the mid and lower 20s. They're hardy enough that they could probably tolerate that, but I don't want them to be too stressed. Now, in the past, I have had the soil underneath the greenhouse plastic freeze, but I think it's the ambient temperature during the day when it warms up that keeps them alive and thriving. This is my garlic bed that was planted and amended earlier, same way as everything else. And this is the remainder of my fall crops. I think these are just going to have to be harvested and pulled out, and I don't think there's anything else I could plant in here that's going to survive because it's already just getting too cold and it's too late in the season. And I don't have anything started. But the main issue, the big issue, is the sheer amount of aphids that accumulated over the fall. And then when I covered them, they proliferated. I do have a cauliflower that can be harvested though. It's really tiny. So I think I'm just going to leave these uncovered and harvest them. They just really are not doing well. Look how bad that is with all the aphids. And look how gorgeous this area is. This is my compost area. We've got my cherry tree that finally in the last couple of days has changed color. Peach trees that have been slowly going dormant and losing their leaves, and we've got this glorious carpet of fall leaves. And here we are with my compost piles. Now my compost, I've done several videos, and I'll link some of the videos on how I do compost. But my compost piles are done the extremely lazy way. I've got 3 bins. This bin all summer long collects all of my garden waste. You know, we do have fall leaves in here from last fall that I put in here. They're at the very, very bottom. And then we have the garden waste on the top. Actually, I think actually midsummer I may have moved all of this out. Actually, I think midsummer I moved all the leaves out of this one and into these other beds. This one I've been harvesting the compost out of. And this one has not had anything taken out of it yet. So this is how much it decomposes in 1 year. And let me show you what the compost looks like. This is a 1-year compost. Fall leaves, garden waste, and whatever else I have to throw in there. Absolutely gorgeous. No churning. The only water it gets is from this spray head that goes off every 2 weeks with the drip irrigation on the hill that I have here. I'm up on a hill. And the drip irrigation that waters that hill is tied to this little spray head, and this little spray head waters both of these beds. Now, up until this year, when I do compost, I take a lot of time, I sift out all the big chunks, and then I just use the pure sifted compost. But I don't have that kind of energy or time this year, so I think what I'm going to do is just pull out the biggest chunks with my hand, throw those into this pile to be recomposted, and then use chunky compost. I don't think it's going to be a problem, especially since I'm putting the grass clippings and the mulch over the top. You know, if there's any big chunks in it next year when I put plants in the ground, I'll just pull the big chunks out. So let me show you what it looks like first when it's sifted so you can see how beautiful it is, and then we'll go ahead and fill up this wheelbarrow with unsifted compost. Or 2 or 3. Got this added to my sifter, and then I just sift it out. Most of what's left is chunky bark, so what I do is I just throw it out here and allow that to compost around the fruit trees. Pull out anything else that's really chunky that may have fallen out around the edges. And this is what beautiful, fully composted compost looks like. Rich in nutrients, excellent for your plants, and just an amazing amendment. I've done this for 15 years and I absolutely love it. But as I said, we're not going to sift it out as much this year. We'll just pull out the roots from I get a lot of roots from the cherry tree, compost roots from the cherry tree. We'll just get rid of the chunkiest parts and use the rest. Now, this is about as full as I can navigate with, and it just looks fantastic. If you haven't tried making your own compost, definitely make it. Like I said, I'll link my compost making videos down below. It's very, very easy. You can make compost as intensively as you want, like I did in California. I hot composted in California where I was cycling through piles like once every 6 to 8 weeks. I would keep them warm, I would turn them regularly, keep them watered, make sure I had the proper ratio of materials. And I produced a ton of compost in a small area. But here in Utah, I'm just a little tired more easily. I'm getting older, and I don't want to mess with my compost pile. So now I do what's called cold composting. Very, very easy. Mess with it once or twice a year, and that's it. So that is it for the compost in this bed. It's filled up nicely. Now I'm just going to finish the other beds. Get as much compost in these as possible. My goal today is to empty out the first bin, the first compost bin, so that I can add compost to my Jerusalem artichokes. I'm going to be releasing my video of harvesting the Jerusalem artichokes first, but I want to have enough compost so that I can fill up this bin. So this video is going to be finished a little bit later. I'm just going to go finish emptying that bin, that compost bin, so we can add more garden waste. You know, this is more garden waste, and have compost for this bed. And then And then on another day, we're going to be mowing the lawn and adding the straw. Well, it's the next day, and I finished moving all the compost I'm going to be moving for my garden beds. Completely emptied out this one. These are from my artichokes from my last video, which I'll link above. This is the new pile that I started working on, removing the compost from. Now, I'm not going to be adding any more to the garden beds, so now comes the end of the year shuffle. This compost is going to move over here where this hay pile is. This hay, or straw. This straw was used to mulch around my fig trees last winter, and I've been using it to mulch the garden beds. So what I need to do is mulch the garden beds that are left. Then I need to take the rest of the straw and we're just going to add it to the compost pile. Once all of this straw is moved out of the way, then the rest of that compost will move over here, and then I'll put a tarp over it for the winter. And then what I use it for is any beds that need compost in the spring, and I also use it to make my potting soil mix. Now I have a series that I'm doing on indoor gardening. I do a lot of indoor gardening. I grow a ton of stuff, including tomatoes and cucumbers, peppers, lettuce, greens, and I make my own potting soil. And so I'll link the playlist at the top on the videos that I'm making, showing you how I do that. But anyway, that's not going to happen today. We don't have enough time. I'm still struggling to try to finish up the end of the year design stuff, but it will be included in this video possibly. Maybe the next one, we'll see. But anyway, that's what's going to happen with the rest of that compost. So let me take you down to the garden beds and show you what I did with the rest of the compost. So what I did, this is the bed that I showed you that I already spread compost on. And I've got these beds filled up. I removed all my artichokes and replanted them. And I filled this up with peat moss, compost, and vermiculite. Now let me show you what those products look like separated, because we're going to work on these beds a little bit. Now I'm not going to completely finish doing these beds because I'm going to be leaving the chard and the kale up over the winter. And also I don't have enough peat moss, and I just don't have it in me to go purchase it before next spring. So we're just going to show you how I make my mix for these beds on one half of the bed. So there's one side. And here's another. I'm also going to leave the arugula, I can never pronounce it correctly, in this bed over the winter just to see how long it lasts. So we're not going to amend that half of the bed. So it's just a recent thing that I've been bringing in topsoil to try and use in my garden beds. And as I said a little bit earlier, I did not like it for the sweet potatoes, but I did like it for the tomatoes. But the original beds that I've made that I've already put my Mel's Mix in, I'm just going to leave those the way they are. Now, Mel's Mix is from Square Foot Gardening. I found that it is the best soil mix to use in my raised beds. And it's 1/3 peat moss, 1/3 compost, and 1/3 vermiculite. Now you can use any kind of compost that you have available to you. I have homemade compost, so I use that. Sometimes I'll use bagged compost. And then I use peat moss. Now you can also use coco coir if you're trying to go peat free. It just depends on what your needs are. So we have our peat moss and we have our compost. And what I have yet to add is vermiculite. So vermiculite is kind of this really cool shiny product. It's man-made. And what it does is it absorbs water and nutrients and then releases them slowly back into the soil. And vermiculite has been the game changer in my garden beds. If I don't use vermiculite, then I end up needing to water, once every day or once every other day. If I do add vermiculite and make sure I add enough of it, then I only need to water 2 times a week, 3 times a week in the hottest times of the year. Now, the one issue that I have found is, and I don't know if it's related to the vermiculite or not, is my garden beds have extremely high iron levels. And from what I've read, vermiculite can be a cause of that. I did talk to the extension service in my area, and they said that the high iron levels are likely not a problem in my garden beds because we have such alkaline soil that iron is probably tied up. What it does mean is I do not need to add iron to my garden beds, and I should not be adding it. Matter of fact, I have high potassium and high phosphorus levels, so the only thing I really should be adding as a fertilizer is nitrogen. And that's why I feel soil testing is so important. If you test your soils, you'll know what you're high in and what you're not high in, and then you'll know what you need to add and what you should not be adding. So I'm going to add some of this vermiculite, just because I like the water holding capacity it offers. And I'll go add it to the other bed. And now we'll just mix it together. So that's what it looks like. Now it has a little extra straw in it, some leaves, but these will break down over the winter. An interesting fact is this is how I make my potting mix. Except for when I make potting mix, I use perlite instead of vermiculite. I don't like using perlite in my garden beds because it just seems to float to the surface. And my beds seem to drain just fine without it. Now I'm not going to finish these two beds, as I said, right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is see if I have time. Let me check and see if I have time. I may have time to mow the lawns and throw some lawn clippings on these garden beds. I'm going to prioritize the garden beds that are already finished. And these two that I'm going to finish in the spring, I think what I'll do is just put straw over the top of them to mulch them. And that may end up happening another day because I've got an appointment in an hour. And I've got to leave in an hour. So let's see how much we can get done. Now I've actually got to go, so I'm going to finish this video another day. But I'm not worried about all the leaves that were left on the lawn because I actually go through once all the leaves have finished falling. We've got a big storm coming in this week, a couple of them. Hopefully what that'll do is bring down the rest of the leaves. Then I do a major leaf cleanup and I clean my lawn up really well. Now the reason I do that is the first year that I moved in, this is about how the lawn was cleaned up. I moved in October. I didn't have my mower yet, and I didn't think it needed to be mowed. I didn't think it needed to be cleaned up. It looked good to me. I figured it would just all disappear under the snow. But the next spring, when I came out, the clumps of leaves had matted and they made big bald spots on my lawn, and it took 2 years to get the grass to grow back in the bald spots. So now, out of a little bit of PTSD, because I like my lawn, I clean up the leaves really, really well. I make sure there are no leaves left on the lawn. Now, they do get put in my compost. They do get put on my garden beds. I'm not going to have enough this go around to cover all my garden beds. But we've covered 2 beds. And if we don't have enough to cover the rest of them, that's fine. They'll be covered in straw. And they've got compost down. They'll be good. It's just this is the way I use my grass clippings. Well, it's another glorious day. It's just been taking me a long time to get this project done. The last thing that needs to be done is the straw over the top. Now, this is how much this bed was filled up with the mix that I made. We've got some large chunks of bark in there. That comes from my compost pile. We'll clear those out or we'll just leave them in there. They'll be fine. And then we'll finish the rest of this in the spring. And for that reason, we're not going to put the leaves and the grass over the top. We'll just do that when we plant these up next year. This one we got a little less than half filled. So we'll just add the straw over the top of this one too. But once I got the mowing done, I found a huge batch of leaves to mow up, and I was able to cover the rest of these. Now these would be absolutely fine if I just left the leaves over the top, but I do like to finish the covering with straw. So we're going to go get the straw and get this finished. I love this area with this blanket of leaves. I will be raking all of these up a little bit later, probably next week, once the rest of these leaves have fallen. We've got a big storm coming in on Sunday. We had one last night, and it's starting to knock all the leaves off. Once the leaves are all on the ground, they'll all go in the compost pile. So we've just got to finish getting this compost pile ready to switch over. It's not going to take too much longer. Once again, it's not something that's going to happen today. Today, the only thing I have time for is to get this pile of straw that's covered in leaves down to the garden beds. Well, I think I've got enough work done for today. We moved this half bale of straw that was left over from mulching the fig trees, just so you can see what a mulched fig tree looks like. I have 8 of them that have straw stuffed in around a cage, and I'll link a video on how I did that. I'll link that video up above. But this was the leftover straw. It's a new bale, and I kind of like it when the new bales can sit outside over the winter or over the summer and start breaking down before I use them as mulch. Now, one quick thing before we show you what we finished up at the top. Some people worry about straw causing a weed problem. Now, straw does have seeds. This is a seed head right here. Yeah, this is a seed head right here. I think most of the seeds have dropped out of this. And it'll grow these little grasses. But they are really, really easy to pull. They're really easy to, turn under. They're not perennial, they're just annual. Here's a full seed head. But it doesn't cause that much of a problem. I was really worried about it, and it has not been an issue for me. Yes, they sprout. No, it's not a problem. So here's where I put that half bale of straw to overwinter. We're going to let the rain soak through it and kind of let it start breaking down. Under here is all the leftover compost. This is going to be used to make potting soil over the winter, and then whatever's left over after I make all the potting soil I want will go back on the garden beds in the spring. This is all the old straw I didn't use to mulch the beds, plus all the artichoke stuff. So this is all the makings for my new compost pile. We've got all the detritus from over the summer, and now I've got my fall cleanup to do. And when I do the fall cleanup, that's when I build my compost piles. This is what's left in this compost pile. I may put more of it on that bed over there, but what I need is a full wheelbarrow full to make the new compost piles. So instead of using an inoculant or something like blood meal, I just use old compost, and that helps break everything down really quickly. And this is what my beds look like when they're put to bed for the winter. They are actually ready to be planted next spring. All I'll need to do is add some fertilizer. I think maybe I'll get a soil test and see if I need potassium or phosphorus. If not, then we'll just add blood meal. Last soil test that I did showed that I tested high in iron and phosphorus and potassium. And I did not add any fertilizer that had those in it other than compost. And I put the compost in just now. And you have to have something to fill up the garden beds. And I don't want to use the topsoil that I used in these beds. I don't like it that much. I really actually prefer the Mills mix. So that's another large project finished, and I think I only have one more. Well, I guess we'll count it as 2. And that's my fall cleanup, where I cut back all my perennials and anything that needs to be cut back over for the fall. And then the leaf cleanup. And the leaf cleanup takes me forever because I have, here, let me show you what I have. all my fruit trees, and then I have my neighbor's poplars. The neighbor's poplars drop huge amount of leaves on this hill. And I don't like to leave them on the hill because they form an impenetrable barrier and it just sloughs the water off the hill. So I rake as many as possible. I leave quite a few up there, but not enough to create a barrier. So I have a ton of leaves, makes huge compost pile, and then all of it breaks down to make beautiful compost. And one last thing, isn't this glorious? This is a cotoneaster. I mean, it's a messy bush, but oh my word, it is gorgeous in the fall. And this is why I love it, and this is why I leave it. Absolutely gorgeous. So I'd love to hear what fall projects you're doing, and if you still have some left on the table to finish, and if so, how do you finish them? How long does it take you to do them? My leaf cleanup typically takes me 2 to 3 days, just depending on how much of the garden bed cleanup I have left during that time. This year I've tried to get everything else done early, so when I do the leaf cleanup, it goes a little quicker. Yeah. But anyway, I hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has been helpful, I hope you like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and go have a wonderful garden adventure.